Welcome to the fourth and final lecture of week 4 of the semester. Here we're going to be looking at symbols of the sports community with a main emphasis on mascots, but also just really anything that can work as a symbol, sort of unifying a community or representing a social identity or a community. So, symbols for identity. So beyond the actions and words of a social identity or social group, use of visual symbols is really key for unifying or bringing together or sort of encapsulating what fans are cheering for and about, and what sort of they share this sort of shared experience. So city and regional teams certainly feel this very deeply and very personally as a member of the community. The mascots or the local teams are very much a sort of a binding element in the community, or almost sort of a flag that they all sort of wave in unison, brings them together and unites them. If a city's large enough or a region is large enough, there are actually multiple sort of sports fan identities within the region. So in Chicago, we have the White Sox and the Cubs. New York obviously has the Yankees and Mets. In more of a regional, we have Louisville versus Kentucky. So it can be divided up in a number of ways for certain allegiances, but again, it's still sort of this calling out to fellow members. So even in Chicago, if you have White Sox gear on, you're really calling out to fellow members of the White Sox fan base, saying, "Look, I fit in. I'm one of you. We can sort of relate to each other on a level that we can't with sort of non-White Sox fans, or Cubs fans certainly do the same thing." It's really sort of an identity peg, is what it's called in some scholarship, where we're sort of establishing, here's who I am, here's my identity, and I either fit in, and you're kind of sort of calling out to other members, saying, "Yes, I'm one of you too." So, for instance, I wear occasionally some Iowa Hawkeye gear, and if I'm walking around town and a fellow Iowan or a fellow Hawkeye fan spots it, they usually give some sort of shout out, "Go Hawks," or "Are you from Iowa?" kind of thing. And typically I do it as well. If I see someone else wearing the Iowa Hawkeyes logo or Iowa Hawkeyes gear, I stop and say, "Hey," and especially when we're outside of Iowa, it just sort of is kind of a conversation starter, is that we're both from Iowa, or we're both Hawkeye fans, something like that. So really it's calling out to fellow members of the community. And even if that city is large enough that it has multiple sort of sub sports identities within it, like Yankees and Mets, you're still calling out to sort of members that share that community with you. That's for when you're wearing it, or when you're wearing these symbols. And it doesn't have to be symbols for just sports fan symbols. It can be for any element of life. So your third discussion item is just the symbols that we use in life. So think about the types of identities I have laid out here. So a spouse or parent identity. What types of visual representations would they be able to highlight to show people that they're a spouse or a parent, or whatever relationship you want to have them highlighting? How would they be able to show that without actually having to tell people that, "Hey, I'm a parent," or something like that? Or a police officer. Talk about the symbols that the police system uses to showcase and highlight the police officer identity. Also, there's religious identity, so talk about the symbols that might get used by Christians to showcase that they are sort of members in faith, or sort of members of the community. And then also national identity. Talk about the symbols that people might wear or surround themselves with to let others know that, "Hey, I belong, I'm an American, I believe in sort of American values." So go through those 4 types of identities and talk about the symbols of those identities. And go ahead and take a few minutes to hop over to your discussion post. There'll be one more discussion item in this lecture, so make sure you come on back and watch the remainder of the lecture. So let's talk a little bit more about the role of symbols in sports. And the reading talks about it as a symbolic locus of unification. So it can bring people together, this sort of tools for community building that work over time and across all sort of different levels of society. So across socioeconomic status, across perhaps a region or perhaps even a nation. This community building element of it. They represent a system of symbols, actually, with colors, terms, images on the mascots themselves, certain movements, certain moods or attitudes or responses to either the game or other players or other mascots, etc. All of these are sort of a system of symbols that help in this community building effort. And in this way, they constitute and reaffirm that community. So those mascots and those team colors can get used regularly as sort of touchstones for members of that community to continue to come back to and sort of build and constitute this community. That would maybe perhaps, in terms of sports fans, if they didn't have these types of the mascots or uniforms, team colors, they would really feel sort of disconnected with other fans of the team. The reading goes a lot into sort of Native Americans and the use or misuse of Native American mascots, pointing out that in many cases, Native Americans themselves are not actually members of the sports fan community that their mascots are serving. There are certainly examples where Native American tribes have been brought in. The Florida State Seminoles, for example, I know have done quite a bit of work with the Seminole Nation to sort of have a continual conversation to make sure things are being handled how both sides want them handled. But in many cases, Native Americans aren't necessarily a part of the conversation. Their mascots are just taken and used to build a community that is separate from the actual Native American tribe that it might have been somehow loosely tied to at its origins. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about how a symbol works, and let's use as our example sex, sort of the anatomical definition or element of a person. So that's very sort of the straightforward version of it. But sex as a signifier is a source for so many other things. So a categorization of people, defining behaviors, placing roles on individuals, values, meanings, and all of these other things get derived from this sort of initial element of defining someone's sex. So all of these other things get built off of it. And then at some point, they get seen as being caused by that person's sex rather than just being socially defined, socially created. So the role that someone plays in a household or the role that someone plays in society is certainly a socially constructed role. But if it's tied to someone's sex enough over time, it actually takes on what appears to be sort of a causal relationship between the two of them. And other symbols work in a similar way. So there's the actual element of a symbol itself. So the mascot, there's the words or image or a living person in a costume or some sort of moving object. And that's sort of easy enough to understand. It's sort of a very straightforward thing. But when the mascot as a signifier is a source for so much else. So categorization of sports fans, defining behaviors for sports fans, placing roles on what we're supposed to do and when we're supposed to do it, placing shared values and meanings. So a mascot works in a similar type of process as any other symbol. So you can take the mascot at sort of face value. It's just a guy dressed up as a dog. But when the mascot starts its work as a signifier, it takes on so much more sort of definition of roles and values and behaviors, taking on sort of a larger force in that community. And once a mascot has taken on that sort of larger scale, becoming a signifier, we see its impact over time. So the Yankees is a mascot for a Major League Baseball team based in the Bronx, taken very straightforward. So that's sort of what the mascot is. But once it takes on the role of signifier, it becomes more of an idea, not an actual team. It represents the team, but it's timeless. So at any one moment, there is a Yankees roster, but a year from now or months from now or even tomorrow, that roster could be different, but there's the Yankees still remains. Or 5 years, there's nobody on the roster that was on the roster currently. 5 years from now, nobody is still on the roster, but it's still the Yankees. It might even be the case where they switch teams with a rival or come from a rival to our team. So it's somebody that we were cheering against and now they're part of our team, so we're cheering for them. So that's how impactful this signifier can be. Is it what would seemingly be an irrational behavior if I cheer against this person on one day and then I cheer for the person on the next day. Well, the person hasn't really changed that much. Just the idea around them and who that person is playing for is what's changed. So the players in this mascot signifier relationship, the players almost become irrelevant. It's the team itself that is the thing that's cheered for, and that is where the idea becomes timeless and sort of separate from the actual members of the team. So, for example, the Cleveland Browns have had two teams with two separate ownership and years in between those two teams. Yet they are seen by the fan base as having a singular history, when in fact the second Cleveland Browns could have been anything else. They could have been the Cleveland Midwesterners, and it would have been as equally different a team as the original Cleveland Browns were, but because they put that mascot and that signifier on there that they're the Cleveland Browns, they automatically tapped into that history, that timelessness of the signifier Cleveland Browns. So in order for something to become this sort of larger institutional fact that we all just accept, like the New York Yankees, so, for example, we can't just have a bunch of dudes get together and call themselves the New York Yankees and everybody just believes it or accepts it. It's sort of large enough masses of people over a long enough period of time have made that sort of a socially accepted institutional fact. But it does take this sort of collective intentionality. We're all playing along with this game together. We all pretend that the Yankees and Red Sox are real things, and that even though the players change, even from Yankees to Red Sox or vice versa, that there's still this thing that's the New York Yankees and this thing that's the Boston Red Sox. It's those signifiers that have that deeper meaning involved with them. And this is the trick that we play on our own minds that allow us to describe teams in terms of us and we, they, and all the sort of the pronouns that we use to describe teams is a sort of mental trick. So if we're already kind of tricking ourselves that these things are real, why not include ourselves in the game as well? That's what the authors were getting at when they're talking about collective intentionality. So we all agree that something exists, and therefore it does exist. So adults all gather for cocktails, and we call it a cocktail party. It could be called any number of other things, but because we call it this cocktail party and there's certain sort of values and expected behaviors that are all tied in with it, that defines the context, that defines the situation, what roles people should play, how they should dress, how they should behave. It's the same thing for almost anything else that is kind of socially constructed. It's just that we all agree that this is a thing, and we all agree that it can define the context of behaviors and attitudes and what roles individuals should take within that context. So that's what they were getting at when they're talking about collective intentionality. And for collective identity, or collective intentionality rather, to work, we need these symbols to continually sort of bring us back to it, these touchstones, as I mentioned earlier. So we need a mascot, we need team colors, we need the stadium and arena, we need the uniforms. It can't just be 11 players out on the field in football with mismatched clothing and no mascots and no sort of team logos. If it were that and missing all of the mascot and colors, it would really fall flat and wouldn't become sort of this institutional fact that the author talked about in the reading. So when we're playing this sort of large-scale make-believe of kind of socially collective intentionality, we need these elements for us to continue sort of believing and deepening that belief in the team, in the community, so that it sort of becomes that institutional fact over time. You might think of it as in comparison with some social identities or some communities that aren't quite as don't have as rich of a history or deep of a history as our sports teams. So the Comic-Con craze that has been happening maybe in the last decade or so, very much at its relatively early stages still, but think of it when you first heard about it, those communities were maybe looked down upon, not taken as seriously by outsiders, because they hadn't been around long enough to develop into this sort of institutional fact. They didn't have as lengthy of this collective intentionality built into it to be taken as seriously as something as perhaps as serious as like the New York Yankees. When in reality, sports and celebrity culture and Comic-Con and video game culture and anything, all of these are just sort of communities that you're a part of. That nothing is necessarily, air quote, real about them other than the members of the community engage in it, engage with each other, and that's what makes them real. So having mascots and team logos and things like that help bring that community together as sort of a unifying force, and then over time they get taken more seriously, they become institutional fact, just like our favorite sports teams have over the years. So that brings us to our last discussion item of the week. Discuss the mascots of your teams. How are they used? How are they talked about by fans and the teams themselves? Do they play a role in and around the actual games? Try to focus in on how they might be used as sort of a unifying force or part of sort of a shared experience by the sports fan community of the team. All right, and this is your last item of the week. So once you're done with this, you can submit your discussion post, and you're all set for the week in terms of lectures as well.